to live into marginal activity. They have precarious work, if at all. They're mostly unwaged, and they're put together, and they survive on the wits, and they put into these sink areas in French, the banlieues, ghettos in America. We have similar things in Britain. These are kind of no-go areas where the unwanted of the world, the dispensable, which is racially coded. So the criteria for admission to these areas is a racialized code, and an exploration of how these borders come and go and change is a very, very, very succinct one. So, I mean, yet another chapter worth reading. Each chapter is a book in itself and well worth reading.
I'm not sure what conclusion she reaches. Who's read up to the conclusion and stuff?
I mean, I think first of all, when I read the first 101 pages,
yeah,
and I must say, unlike Paul, I was really very disappointed.
Disappointed?
Yeah, because I expected it to, tell us how capitalism evolved and what part racism played within that evolution. And I think when she first describes, a living room and how people are going to protect that living room because that's the center of power, I thought there will be all the struggles that have taken place over the last 400-500 years, would actually give us practical examples of how that was implemented, how racism was used at different points in different places, and how capitalism evolved differently in different places. There's a different settler colonial capitalism. There's a different capitalism, which colonization that takes place. Then there is also, replacement colonialism, settlement colonialism, which actually replaces the existing population with its own. There are very, very different forms of how capitalism evolved in different places. I would have thought she would have actually dealt with that and given us the tools to actually go and debate on these things and create campaigns and fight battles. But I didn't see that.
That's not her purpose. She actually says that that's not.
Well, yeah, I know, but I mean that's what I expected it to do because from the cover,
yeah.
And then you see, I think in a way I liked the introduction when I read it for the first 2 pages, but then I got lost with going everywhere, and I mean I get really lost when people start quoting other people and then other people, and then I don't know them. So it's, I mean, it may be all right for the academics to read it because they've been reading all these books. We haven't. But also, I mean, I think it does not provide a clear analysis. And I think it's wrong to say that Marx did not consider the reproduction process, because when he calculated, you see, labor itself is a commodity. It's a special kind of commodity. And what it gets paid is for its regeneration, so that it can provide the labor for the future. And that is included in the cost. Now, who gets paid and who controls everything is a different issue, which is, the woman does a lot of the work, the man controls the purse. That's a different issue. But bringing of the next generation has to be paid for because it cannot be done free. Even if the labor is free, it still requires subsistence both for the labor as well as for the person you're bringing up. So the cost, you can have somebody who's actually been educated to be a doctor. The cost of reproducing that person is going to be much, much higher. He will have a much better living. And the cost of producing somebody is going to just do something menial and very low paid would be different. But that doesn't mean to say that there isn't any cost involved in it and that a payment has actually not been made. It may be made to the wrong person, but it has. So I think there is no such thing. You see, the creation of the next, of labor as a commodity, all right, is not non-productive, it's productive.
If it contributes, of course it does. But the point is that
not only contributes, without it, nothing will happen.
I know exactly. Yeah. But the capitalist, the point that she's making is that to the capitalist, and also in truth, many Marxist scholars historically, the actual work and contribution of women has been erased from the debate. So we're not denying their contribution, which is essential, just that it's been erased from the debate.
Yeah, that's a debate we can have separately. Yeah. We are discussing here capitalism and the forms it has taken. I mean, my understanding of capitalism is that capitalism has within it, even today, has got racial component to it, because without the slavery, the capital would not be what it is today, and that capital doesn't disappear because it remains there forever. Yeah. Even if the company can go bust, but its assets are then sold out to the next company. Okay, so
that's not true. Obviously, it is. But what she's saying is that wasn't inevitable. That had that not reserved.
No, that's what I wanted her to do. You see, it was not inevitable because it didn't follow the same pattern everywhere. Okay, so what I expected it to happen is to say, well, actually, this what happened in Britain. All right, and this is the problems that the capitalists faced, and therefore slavery. I mean, I can understand why slavery came about. All right, because capital needed labor, extensive amount of labor that can be worked very hard. Okay, and it costs very little. So slavery came into being, and therefore, because in Britain, even before capitalism started, slavery was illegal. So you cannot actually have a slave. You cannot slave an Englishman and sell him. So you then have to create a category that is not human, so you can slave them. And that's where racism comes from. So it's an evolution of capital that brings about racism, because it has to differentiate a body of people as non-humans. And if you look at quotes from Churchill or anybody, that's what they do. They say they're not humans. So you can actually treat them as commodities. So when they were insured, they can be thrown out of the ship because they're commodities.
Well, all I can say is that viewpoint is strongly contested about which came first. So we can have different views about it. But
well, in a dialectical thing, it never is a debate about which came first. Slavery existed much before capitalism was even thought about.
Well, yeah, certain sorts of slavery did.
Yeah.
But the point she's making is, which Surinder has echoed and picked up, is that classical Marxism stresses the inevitability, necessity of a certain way of evolving based upon so-called, dialectical materialism and historical materialism. So, and what she is saying, and she supports herself with reference to all these other authors, is that you can't say this is true of capitalism. It has evolved in a myriad sort of ways, and nothing about much of it was inevitable. So this poses, she perhaps at the end, in the last chapter, she does start posing questions about what to do. What do you do with this information? And she poses a kind of a thought experiment, a hypothetical question. Can there be something called anti-racist capitalism? And although it seems to be a silly question, she takes it seriously. Could you have anti-racist capitalism? And she makes the argument that in the sphere of commodification in the marketplace, there's a tendency for capitalists to treat every consumer the same. In a sense, there's a move away from differentiation towards homogenization. Everyone wants a pair of Adidas trainers, no matter where you are. everyone wants a smartphone no matter where you live. So in that sense, she argues you can argue that capitalism doesn't require racism to sell a mobile phone anywhere in the world. It doesn't require racism to sell a pair of $100 Puma training shoes. So all she's doing is the gist of her book is to nuance and interrogate standard Marxist premises, and she argues that it's not as clear cut as we are led to believe. So, for example, she talks about, very interestingly, she talks about the white working class, and she shows that over the last 50 or so years, that the privileged status of the white working class, its sense of stability, its sense of privilege, has gradually been eroded by capitalists who have moved away from the white working class as becoming more and more redundant to their profit making, and they've moved their attention to other populations. And so a lot of so-called white working class racism and xenophobia is a anxiety response to loss of status, as they've been, to use that phrase, left behind or abandoned. So one of their key themes in the book is to show that the notion of the proletariat is not a static notion; it's evolving all the time, and that the proletariat is being reconstructed, reimagined, reconstituted geographically and globally for the purpose of capital making its profits. So even the notion of the proletariat, which historically is conceived as workers emerging in Britain and France and Germany, or the global north, there's even been a change in how you conceive of proletariat. It's moved southwards to the global south, and their nature has changed. And a lot of the antagonism of the white working class to so-called immigrants and black people and so on is because they sense they are losing their privilege. They are being left behind as capitalism moves to exploit other groups of people. So her analysis is very rich in terms of explaining what's actually going on.
Brian wants to say something.
No, Brian wants to say something. Yeah.
Right. I mean, I've got something with Naeem, but I mean, I found the book fairly incomprehensible because of the vocabulary, the terminology, and the fact that it's sort of part of an internal debate amongst sociologists. And I did try and read quite a bit of it. But I mean, as I understand it, I mean, it strikes me that sort of as capitalism developed, it was always global, and that sort of it evolved gradually in various ways and in various places. And it just took on the racist and sexist societies that it gradually overtook. And sort of it's, and the idea that you can have a capitalism without racism, I think misses the point. What we should be doing is analysing the actual existing capitalism that has now gone on to imperialism. That is the one we need to actually analyse, not sort of play academic games about what ifs, because history isn't like that. And that sort of, yes, she's right, that sort of how capitalism took over the world was very much sort of just took on board what was there already and only exploited what it needed to do. I mean, that's why there sort of is still a massive sort of peasantry, small farmer sort of population in the world. But the imperialist system has sort of incorporated that without actually sort of destroying it. I mean, in that sense, Peter's right that sort of there isn't just one inevitable route that we derive from the somewhat Eurocentric writing of Marx and Engels. But I mean, we need to sort of not be playing an academic game, I think, about sort of various schools of Marxism and what have you. We need to actually be analysing the actual existing imperialist system. There aren't separate bits of capitalism or independent capitalist development anymore that sort of, it may not look uniform, but it is a global system. The world market determines the price of food, which has an impact then on the peasantry and what have you. So, I mean, I think we need to talk about, you know, the actual existing capitalism, which was the only one that has developed. It developed on past societies, and it was inevitable that sexism and racism got incorporated in that as it developed. And in that sense, I think, you know, sort of, I didn't find really anything new in what little I could comprehend in her book. But I think, you know, sort of we have to talk about the actual existing system and recognize that historically it was inevitable it would take on the sexist divisions in societies previously, and sort of, you know, prior to sort of capitalism, when the Portuguese and Spanish were dividing up the world, Columbus had slaves, Vasco da Gama had slaves, you know, sort of all that was there, and capitalism, the one that actually existed, built on that. And I think, you know, that we have to talk concretely about the world we actually face. I mean, the one phrase in a book that actually stuck with me was that sort of the only point, I'm paraphrasing possibly, that the only point in studying capitalism was to actually change it. It's not for the world's people, it's not an academic debate. Sorry, I don't know whether that's coherent, but
sorry. I'm sorry, I only read the first chapter, which I thought was like introduction. I found it, I struggled quite a lot because I'm not sociologist and I find it quite difficult. But what I liked about the concept was I thought of it more visually, like it's more of a mesh or a web rather than most of the time we sort of think of it as a thread, something single thread that's developing in a given direction, whereas the way she's putting it across that there's multiple factors in different ways still going towards the same process. And I quite liked her idea of the border or just outside concept of because we know that about what's happening in the real world and here, but it's the way of saying that it's not inevitable part of it. It is actually part of the conception of the way capitalist mode of production is designed. Hence the urban, within the sort of metropolis, the urban poor, or similarly. So it's looking at the world slightly differently to, say, three world theory, developing, underdeveloping, but looking at different blocks, if you like, within that, which I quite like. Also, I think the other things, I mean, the introduction keeps saying it's a description of our current state of things. So she's not giving any plans of what to do. If we can understand what's happening clearly, then we are in a position to then use that to do something else, whatever we want to do. I think that's the way I looked at it. But I only read the first chapter, so I have no idea how she's developing that later.
So the third world, you know, people of color, they produce manufacture things cheaply. So they're being exploited. So it's racism because it's people of color who in the third world who are producing goods on the cheap. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Yes.
I think that was the other thing. You see, I accept that the nature, everything changes all the time, but it has got certain characteristics that makes it what that thing is. So the proletariat changes its character all the time, but basic properties are like in physics. Atom is an atom, no matter how long on how before or how long after. It may change, the way it circulates and everything else, but it still remains. That characteristics, what makes it a proletariat, is always there. It's the fact that
she's defining proletariat as a process rather than as a static.
No, a proletariat. What defines a proletariat is its relationship with the modes of production, right? And
but she's talking about proletarization of the majority of population as a process rather than.
So as long as the person is producing surplus value, okay, he is, and he does not own the means of production, and he has been paid by the person who owns the means of production.
Yeah, but that's what she's destabilizing, isn't it? That category.
This is what she's questioning. She's questioning the whole Marxist concept of a linear way of defining and.
It's not a linear way. Because you can say, whatever else you want to in that respect, but if you say that a proletariat is somebody who flies planes, then it's no longer the proletariat that I understand it to be a proletariat. We have changed the definition, because it's a definition in the end of the day, isn't it?
If you're talking about a proletariat being somebody who produces surplus value, then that's going to be within a wage labour. What she's saying is that wage labour is actually split. There are sometimes non-workers, there are sometimes sometime workers, there are sometimes workers, So
it's quite extensive, yes, that's how she says in the introduction.
There's creates all these things, but non-worker means it doesn't do any work.
But in the proletarian, the strict definition used to be in the industrial concept, isn't it?
It's like a slave is not paid, right?
Very fixed economical relationship, as you said.
I don't think this is anything new, really. I don't know. In sociology, there's always been a debate about, the Marxist definition of class and capitalism and stuff, and then there's this sort of barbarian, that class is all sorts of things, and this is not new. And in some ways, her work could be categorized as very non-Marxist in some ways, because she is destabilizing all those that argument about the fact that your class is interpreted in terms of your relation to production or means of production. And so it could be, but obviously she's arguing from within the Marxist and the feminist sort of.
But if you look at there, you see that a woman who does work at home to produce the next generation, all right, is also involved in that. She's part of that proletariat.
But then what about the work? What about the people who are never employed? That, in terms of they're on the books, as it were. So people, that young people, for example, who for generation haven't been employed.
Yeah, but
they're not doing any reproductive work as such. But
there will be the proletariat can be unemployed, can't it?
No, but they never actually got into the economic.
Yes.
Economic relationship.
Sorry.
They never got into the economic relationship in the first place. So, because they're expanding.
Does not necessarily mean that we have got a contract, because you can only survive by selling your labor. Doesn't necessarily mean you will sell your labor.
Mm-hmm. There's a much more nuance to this. First of all, let's get this very clear, because I think we're being unfair to what she is saying. She never denies what you're saying, Naeem, that there is something called capitalism, and it does nasty things to people, and there are historical trends. Yeah. All she is saying is is that let's look at how this pans out.
Yeah, I'm not disputing that, Paul, but I only raised it because you raised it. But what I'm talking about my personal, because what I expected to see,
Yeah.
right, was to see the evolution of capital, and which is what it doesn't show.
I know, but that wasn't her intention. You can't blame her for doing something she didn't want to do.
I don't know, because I was misled, you see, by something.
If I say I'm going to write a book on X, and write a book on X, you say, I don't like this book because it's affecting Y.
Yeah, because it says rethinking racial capitalism. I assume from that, she will look at capitalism and say, well, how it evolved, everything else.
Does she actually talk about how the third world colored people are exploited?
Can you unmute that person trying to come in from India, I think? Or from Thomas Saff is in as well.
Does she actually talk about how people in the third world are exploited?
Yes, she does. Yes.
She doesn't give any examples, does she? I mean, I expected her to actually, you know, dissect the Palestinian situation, dissect what happened in West Africa.
You're reading the wrong book.
I know I am. In fact, this gave me the idea to actually, you know, do some analysis and write something about it.
I mean, she actually says in the beginning, don't expect here a history of racism. Don't expect a history. She said, you can read all that elsewhere. So she's very explicit in her intentions. And so for me, the test is, here are my intentions in publishing a book or my ideas. Having read the book, do you think I've met my intentions? Now that's the critique of a book, isn't it?
No, because I was misled by the first page, basically.
Okay, well.
Imagine a house with many stories, an attic and a cellar, several annexes that have no direct connections, main room filled with comfort, and a maze of unmappable corridors leading to all sorts of barely remembered wings. And I thought that will show us all the struggles that took place to capture the living room. All right, and that I didn't. I assumed that's what will happen, but I didn't see that. You see.
Okay, but that's a history book you're looking for.
Well, maybe, but I mean that's what she promised me in the first 4 lines.
Right. Okay.
Is that why you asked us to read it?
Between saying she's not writing a history of racism, but then she's talking about racism in relation to capitalism. So I think it is. I think Naeem's point is valid. You know, if it's not taking that into account, what's the point? I mean, you know, I mean, a lot of what she talks about has been done in political economy for ages. I mean, people like Samir Amin and other people I can't think of off the top of my head. I just didn't see that she actually fulfilled her premise. It was too abstract and lacked anything really concrete. Okay, there are a reference to a few examples, but in terms of a concrete analysis about the interrelation between racism and the development of capitalism, there wasn't really any analysis. It was all debating with other sociologists, and as an outside reader, that means absolutely nothing, and there is no concrete facts and figures and concrete examples to prove or disprove her thesis. And I think that must be a valid criticism of the book. It might be just I'm a simple folk and can't comprehend this complicated sociological.
What I'm saying is that because there is this debate about is class only, can class only be interpreted in terms of production, or can it also be talked about in terms of consumption? And so there's, you know, that's already been sort of decided that consumption is an important facet of class. And so I think she's debating within that racism doesn't feature in the same way in that analysis of the relationship of people to the market and of workers to the market. Maybe that's what she's trying to unravel.
I think you also need to understand production can mean many things to many people. And I think maybe, I will have a more comprehensive understanding of production to include everything that adds to commodity production. And labor itself is a commodity. So, bringing up family is a process of actually creating a commodity, which is labor.
Labor power, not labor.
No, labor power, yeah, which is itself a process of production. So, I mean, that's how, I don't know. I'm not going to speak for the Marxists, but some of the Marxists I know, that's what they talk about. When they talk about production, they mean
a standard Marxist theory. That's standard Marxist theory. And what people like her and many post-Marxists are trying to nuance all this and look into the circuits of commodity distribution and seeing how things are different. So I get back to my same point: is nothing which has been said is at odds with what she is saying. What she is doing is taking some themes and to unravel them in terms of that dynamic changeability. For example, she has a very interesting chapter on primitive accumulation. Now, in standard Marxist theory, capitalism began with primitive accumulation. That is to say, assets were stolen from people by brute force or by the force of law. As, for example, the enclosures in England took land away from peasants who could no longer produce for themselves. But in classic Marxist theory, primitive accumulation is a kind of the beginnings of capitalism. The theft of land, the appropriation of land, as for example, for colonies in North America and elsewhere. And what she is saying is that this tray of capitalism, primitive accumulation, has never gone away. And so we see it in India, for example, where the land of the so-called tribals are being taken away. And elsewhere, we see it in Palestine, where land is being taken away, primitive accumulation by brute force. And what she's saying is, as a consequence of this ongoing primitive accumulation, expropriation, it leads to populations who are actually abandoned, who are excluded, like the Palestinians, like the tribals in India. So the general theme of her argumentation is that she takes the basic premises of capitalism to be true. So in that sense, she's just a Marxist. Like any thinking person who studied history, politics and economics, any thinking person can't not be but a Marxist. Marx describes the true nature of the world as it evolved. But on those premises of exploitation, taking a profit, surplus value, all these kind of things which we're familiar with, just saying let's explore these in terms of certain themes, like gendered nature of capitalism and its patriarchy. Let's explore this in more detail and see how it is differentiated around the world. So she emerges with a very complicated picture, which undermines the argument that capitalism is a kind of a linear process. It's a multifaceted process with many dimensions, and it's always changing. So the fact that we have now a resurgence of primitive accumulation, the theft of land, ancestral land, land rich full of minerals, the destruction of the habitat in pursuit of profit, this is primitive accumulation being rediscovered by capitalists. It's never gone away. She's just showing how it replicates itself in different contexts. So for me, that's a very, very powerful account of reality. I don't see how that could be contested. Well, obviously it can be, but for me, I find it very convincing. Yeah.
I think you've got to distinguish between what I was trying to explain probably very badly earlier, that sort of capitalism has become a global dominant system, has only taken over sort of earlier forms or what have you, when it can make a profit out of them. I mean, a lot of food production relies on sort of peasants and small farmers, and they don't work on capitalist relations, but they are encompassed within the broad system. And that sort of, it's not a matter of capitalism going backwards and forwards. I mean, there are concrete reasons why there are still ongoing, what you've termed to be primary accumulation. I mean, sort of, a concrete example is the fact that sort of American farmers find it much more profitable to do biofuels, and so there is a need for sort of food production for the West to actually find new places to grow food. And there's I think a prime example of the interrelation with racism, because they turn up and to these governments in Africa, which essentially they put in place, putting that simply, and they say, where's the deeds for your land? And obviously that is not the way that sort of land tenure was actually perpetuated in a lot of Africa. And so these stooge governments stay back and just let the land be taken over for production of food for the West. You know, I mean, in concrete situations, it's not going backwards, it's actually in the broad stream of how imperialism is developing economically. And that is clearly racist, because they just completely disregard the traditional African basis of land tenure. You ain't got any bits of paper, we're just taking your land. And it's quite massive. I mean, I saw a figure a few years ago of 90 million acres that have been taken over in recent years like that. So yes, these things go on, but they're actually sort of motivated ultimately from the general direction that imperialism as an overarching system is actually developing. Coming back to this actually existing imperialism.
Exactly what Gargi says. That's what she says. She's also got a very interesting chapter, I don't know if people managed to see it, where she talks about historical trauma. It's called HT. Historical trauma is the psychological impact of colonialism on colonized peoples. And it's a very useful chapter to explore some of the issues around historicized trauma, how it affects whole populations, how it affects their well-being, and that sort of thing. It's how people have internalized racism with low self-esteem, and those kind of arguments. So she's coming very much from the perspective of a global south, and she makes a point of saying that she's relied upon theoreticians and, dare we say, academics who are from the global south, who write about capitalism from their perspective. So it's a new look at capitalism from those who are the victims. And this is not academic theorizing or sociology. This is empirical explication of what capitalism does to people based upon a racialized concept of humanity. So this notion of historicised trauma, how it's impacted on people, how that impact is replicated through a legacy of slavery and so on and so forth, is a very important chapter. And in that context, he talks about what could count as compensation for all this.
Yeah,
So we get into a debate about recompense. The argument about recompense and compensation for not just for crimes done in the past to people's ancestors, but the continuing crimes being done as a consequence of what was done in the past. So this notion of a legacy, how it impacts upon people even today. Anyone with a black skin, and that includes several people in this group, have been affected by capitalism and racialized capitalism, by racism. It's affected people adversely. And there's a chapter on the consequences of capitalist violence towards people. So it's a chapter on violence towards people and how it's traumatized whole communities. So it's traumatized, for example, she talks about Aborigines in Australia. She talks about the First Nation peoples of North America, how the legacy of racialized capitalism has left all communities damaged by this process, and it raises then the question, of course, of reparations, which is another interesting story to explore. I don't know if people have views about reparation. I mean, assuming I always recall a good example of this. If my grandfather, as a child, had his bicycle stolen by a boy up the road, by the rich boy up the road, and then he passed that bicycle down to his children and to his children, well, that guy's, 3 generations later, that guy today has got my grandfather's bicycle. I want it back. So it belongs to my family. So just because you've inherited it doesn't make it yours. So this notion of recompense, reparations for the harm done to people, not just for harm done, of course, but for the actual exploited labour. Very few people recognise or articulate the fact that America was built by black people. It was built upon black labour. It has become what it is because of enslaved black labour. Its very wealth today was built upon black labour, enslaved black labour. So there's an issue about indebtedness and reparations. And I'm not sure, what do people feel about that argument, about reparations? I think it's a very interesting argument, very complicated.
We don't disagree with what she says. It's what she leaves out is the problem. Because America as it is today is what it is because of slavery, but it is also what it is because of the annihilation of the indigenous people of the place. So all those things, all right, are particular events in time-space continuum, if you want to think about it. I expected her to say, well, why did capitalism need to do that to the indigenous people? Why then it felt necessary to bring the slaves from Africa, right? And I wanted some concrete examples of how that happened, and that would have taught us something that we can take forward. Because this book, as an activist, it doesn't help me at all. Okay. Also, I expected this book because we can also look at the current, and the racism that is today is not only there because it was there 500 years ago. It is also there because capitalism needs it today as well. And that needed to be analyzed and put in context so that we can actually understand why, to me, looking at it, it's very stupid for capital to be racist, because what is it gaining from it? We need to get those things out. What it is gaining, what it is doing. Okay. And I think that's where my problem is. It's not what she says. I agree with everything she says. All right. It's what she doesn't offer is what my problem is.
The reparation and recompense is one of the demands of black movement, wasn't it? Black power and Pan-African movements. I think
But
that's one of the.
I mean, what they mean by that is not that individual is paid, 500 years later. What they're saying is that there should be money spent in providing education, in providing social services, in providing everything else, and to eradicate inequality that exists today. And that inequality that exists today, it keeps capitalism going.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. Because a large number of the population in this country working on 0-hour contract, okay, can only do that on the basis of racism, right? And because it then divides it, and it's how it works. And I think that, I mean, I haven't done the analysis on it, but that is something that is required.
Yeah, well,
I think that part of reparation should be to allow asylum seekers permanent residency.
And also, I mean, at least she says this, that they should also stop committing the crimes. I don't know whether she said it, because I've been reading other people as well in the meantime to see where things are. But, it's not just enough to say we are sorry. You also need to stop doing what you're doing.
Yes.
So it's no good just saying sorry and continue the same things.
Of course, yeah. The reparation argument tends to be along the lines you described. It's obviously got nothing to do with cash payments to individuals. It's to do with, in recognition of the harm done to racialized communities, black communities, the harm done to them through history and through current arrangements, which has consequences for their well-being, for their education, for their earning power, and for all sorts of important factors which makes life bearable. Resources should be put into rebuilding communities with facilities. For example, it tends to be the case that in the poorest areas, the quality of teaching in the local schools is nowhere as good as quality of teaching in middle-class areas because of the way things work out. So this notion of it's almost kind of a positive action program to invest resources into producing structural well-being for black communities, education, health services, youth clubs, proper housing. So reparations really means in this context taking resources from elsewhere and putting them into building well-being arrangements for the disadvantaged and abused and oppressed communities. But she also talks about, so that's about, in one sense, wages being paid after the event, being paid in retrospect for wages not paid at the time. But she also talks about the problems of reparation in terms of how racism has affected black communities in terms of their mental well-being, their psychological well-being, which is much more esoteric. But it's an area of research which has been little developed. But the harm done to black people is almost immeasurable. And trying to compensate for it is almost impossible because the magnitude of the harm is too great. So now she raises interesting dilemmas about what's to be done, and she does say, what's to be done, and her approach is, now you've read my book, I hope, she says, I'm paraphrasing her words, she says, if you manage to get through my book, I just hope that it will help other people, including yourself, work out ways to do something about all this. So she's offering as a kind of a primer, more knowledge, more information to comprehend what's going on. as a way of informing our political action. So the idea of that she is against, you know, she doesn't, is not involved in political action, is not true. And it can't be true if you know her personal history. You know, a great anti-racist political activist. Her book is intended to help anyone interested to make better decisions about how to take action against racism. And for me, that can't be a bad thing.
Well, I would have thought that if that was the purpose of the book, it would actually be readable, so that a broad number of people could actually understand it and learn lessons from it. And it quite clearly is not accessible to other than academics, by and large, who are schooled in the language of sociology. I mean, I'm not an illiterate halfwit, but I mean, I was reaching for the dictionary, you know, about every other paragraph, because there were words in it I'd never even heard of, and not just terminology. You know, I mean, if you're going to have something that people can use in practical action, then, and I'm not criticizing her wider political activity that's been done, but I'm just saying I don't see how this book is actually of any practical use to activists. And by activists, I don't mean sort of people in universities and what have you, departments. I mean the people out there that can actually are facing these issues and sort of are going to be in the forefront of any change. I don't see that it, I think you're attributing something to it that it can't possibly be. And that's not a criticism of her and any political activities done. I'm just saying it's not a manual that has use in terms of educating people other than a small circle who seem to be going round and round in circles discussing with one another.
I think there was one thing that come out to me. I didn't read all the book at all, but parts I read, and quoting other people, and particularly there's a guy called Sanyal, I think, who's got this concept of the wastelands, and she's bringing that in as well in a number of places. And the idea that in the countries that have been impressed by imperialism, and you have this development system going on, and there's vast tracts of people are not going to be proletarianized, i.e. they're not going to be producing surplus value, they're still going to be working on their land or starving. And at the same time, you've got a parallel to that in the imperialist countries, where there's a whole area of people who are not able to produce surplus values because there's no employment for them, and they live in this sort of wasteland area with its own economy to some extent, and presumably crime and various methods of survival exist parallel to the economy where there is a sort of direct production of surplus value. And that the importance of that, obviously, to any kind of revolutionary program is that you can't rely on the industrial proletariat or those who actually directly produce surplus value to overthrow the system without taking into account the revolutionary potential of that wasteland sector, which may in fact be a lot more revolutionary than the proletariat in many places. She doesn't develop that argument, but it comes through to me possibly from some she quotes from.
And the logic of that, if go back to previous discussions, is interesting in terms of rioting, so-called, which is a racialized code term for angry black people. So many writers argue that what's called rioting, so rioting takes place typically by these people you're describing, who live in the wastelands, who live precariously, in and out of jobs, maybe in so-called informal economy, bit of wheeling and dealing, sometimes criminality. These are the communities she talks about, who have been abandoned and left to, she calls these areas, as I said before, the necropolis, places where people are left to die, slowly but surely. But very typically, such people can become quite radical in moments of great indignation, and when the police are acting extra brutally, and so many people. This goes back to your point about revolutionary potential. Is that a typical riot, which involves burning cars and looting shops, is an expression of political discontent, and it can be mobilised. You know, the fact that you may have 100 young men in the streets fighting the police, these are the revolutionaries in the making. Just like in the Paris Commune in 1870, you know, people went to the barricades. But of course, a part of racism, part of white supremacist ideology, is of course to condemn these people as criminals and hooligans, using a stereotype of violent young black men. The BBC always talks about looting as if it's endemic. You know, it might have been one shop. No one talks about the looting done by capitalism. And no one talks about how capitalism creates rights around the world. So her insights into the wastelands, this urban in-between area, this kind of purgery, it invites us, as you suggested, to explore its potential. So for me, that's very much a practical consequence of her argumentation. How does one mobilise?
Right at the beginning, she makes a sort of an important point, I think, that where she says that perhaps we shouldn't be thinking about racialization of capitalism, but thinking about race as class. I can't remember the sort of exact thing that she says, but I think it's an important point. But she doesn't, as far as I've read it, she hasn't developed that in any way. But in a sense, her book seems to be more about solidarity along class lines, and maybe that's what she's thinking about, rethinking racialization. I don't know what the rethinking is, except for all the bits that we've already discussed. But maybe that's
but her concluding final paragraph, I think, if I recall correctly, the challenge is how to unite differential groups with a common purpose. So she really stresses again that the diverse different groups, white working class, black working class, the unemployed, with precariat, women and so on, she makes a point that they've got different life experiences, they've been touched by capitalism in different ways, and they respond in different ways. Sometimes that creates antagonism between different groups of people within the working class. And she says, no, our hope is to somehow get people to recognise the commonalities amongst themselves, to overcome the differences as the condition, the precondition of any successful radical change in society. In terms of revolutionary change, it can only come about, she argues, if diverse oppressed groups who have been hurt by capitalism in different sorts of ways overcome their differences to work together. That is a hope. And we began to see a bit of it, I think, with Black Lives Matters, where we've seen especially young white people coming out on the streets in support of black people. People begin to recognise commonalities, and I think that's one of the thrusts of her book. That's a lesson she tells us to always inculcate, is search out the commonalities amongst our differences because we have a common enemy. That's her message. She gives no comprehensive, detailed textbook answers how to do that, but she poses a question which, in posing a question, you must never forget it.
I think, you know, one of the other things that actually misled me, I'm going to quote you again from her book. She said, everything we have learned about capitalism reminds us that only the will to accumulate remains the same. And I think that is the driving force. And if you then can see that drive, and she says, goes on to say, no such thing as the capitalist state, no arrangement of workers that is replicated everywhere, no necessary similarity in the pattern of concessions that workers may win. And I think that is something that I can completely agree with. Okay, but what I then wanted to see is examples of how that worked in each point in capitalism, in each space and in each time. So, you know, I would have thought slavery would have come into it. In fact, you know, capitalism in Britain would have come into it. Early capitalism, late capitalism, industrialization.
Very big.
What is happening today? But that's not there. Huh?
Be a very big book.
Well, no, the point is that she does other things which she didn't need to do.
Okay. Sorry you're so disappointed. Yeah.
All right.
I think in raising those sort of commonalities, realizing the commonalities, that goes back to what I was talking about last week, that there are those sort of objective commonalities between, you know, different categories of black people, but there isn't the solidarity. So it goes back to the same question, doesn't it? How do we come together on the commonalities?
Because there are differentiations.
Yeah, no.
But there are, isn't it? There's a difference between a slave and an indentured labor. They are both oppressed, and they are going to react differently.
Yeah.
Okay, then shall we end our discussion?
Yeah.
Thank you very much for all who presented.
Very quiet, Tom.
Continue with the
Tom,
thing.
you read the book. You've been very quiet.
No, I read only 20 pages. So
Oh, fair enough. Just as well to keep quiet then. Yeah.
So shall we continue with the book or something new?
We could why don't we take a chapter and look at it in more detail?
That would be great.
I don't know. Do other people want to do that, or do you want to move on to something else?
Yeah, move on to something else.
I thought I was going to talk about. I was thinking about talking about Bangladesh in relation to.
Yeah.
Actually, yes,
Go ahead.
yeah.
Go ahead.
And in fact, in terms of the, you know, the way labor is being exploited to provide for the